how did all this begin? How did I end up believing that the event is in the past or becoming a preterist? How did all this happen? Because I used to believe the event was in the future too. I mean, ask anyone that knows me directly, and they'll tell you I believed in the second coming in the future. I believe that we live in the last days before the end of the world, before the establishment of the 1,000-year reign. I believe all this stuff. I believed, past tense, all these things. What happened is that one day I noticed that according to the context, the authors of the New Testament as well as the initial receivers are the people that live in the last days. And that, John the Baptist shows up in Matthew the 3rd chapter, and he is preaching that the kingdom of God is at hand, that it's near, nigh, imminent. In fact, he uses the Greek word agizo, that implies imminency. It's the word they translate for near or nigh. And I realized that living some 2,000 years later, 2016, now when I'm recording this, that there's people, my own self and my previous persuasion, who believe that kingdom has not been established today, and that we're awaiting the establishment of that kingdom, which of course will be a literal 1,000 years on the earth. And it's very funny because John says the event is close, that's near, but I, 2,000 years later, also believe it's close and near. And I essentially made this contextual realization. So then, I went through the New Testament on my own, and I began to take note of when they said the day of the Lord was going to happen, when these events were supposed to happen. And much to my surprise, the great number of references that are used, the overwhelming majority, if not absolutely every single one, discusses the event happening immediately. I compiled a list of more than 100 verses, I think around 150 some verses, that showed that the event was only discussed as happening immediately. One of the verses that really was a true trouble to me was 1 John 2:18. It says, "Little children, it is the last hour." And then he goes on to explain how he knows for certain it is the last hour. And seeing these verses just in their plain dryness, no religious lens applied, just reading it for what it said, there was no other conclusion to come to. One of the most startling problems I ran into is Matthew 24. In Matthew 24, if I was just reading it according to the context, when does this conversation start and stop and another conversation start, reading it kind of like that, there was no way for me to separate out the fact that Matthew 24 is Jesus responding to the questions that they asked, his disciples asked, regarding the statement that Jesus made about the place that they just were at. There was no way to divorce this context. It was so overwhelming. And even when you go look at Mark 13 and Luke 21, the parallel accounts, it's the same problem. They're leaving the temple, they're talking about how beautiful it is. Jesus says to them, "You see this building, not one stone will be left on top of another." I call it jaw-dropper Jesus, a statement that is so flooring, you really just have to have a total hold-on moment. What does that mean? They of course have this moment with Jesus and say, when will this happen? When is the sign of thy coming? Which they relate to be the same thing. And what is the end of the world? Which is most certainly this event, being it is the focal point of the entire discussion. Not to mention it's where they just were. Matthew 23 is them at the temple. It's amazing. Jesus then responds, and he says, in his answers, one of the first things he says is, "Let no one deceive you." It's amazing to consider that I am the individual being deceived when they are having a conversation voice to voice. I don't know how else to put it to a person. They're both alive and breathing when this conversation is being had. If you believe the event is happening to you, you believe the record of their conversation is more important than the conversation about the event they said is happening immediately. And that's what I mean. The lunacy almost of the logic won me over before I even understood the significant details that I'm starting to kind of see now. And that's how I ended up this way. Individuals in general are not reading the text according to the context. Old or New Testament, you go to an Old Testament verse like Isaiah 17, Damascus is going to be made a ruinous heap. They can tell you about verse 1. I'm telling you, when you go look at the rest of the chapter, The overwhelming verses are discussing the destruction of northern Israel. The connecting verses between Damascus and Israel say that at roughly the same time, so easily the same power is going to cause the destruction to northern Israel is also going to cause the destruction to Damascus. Damascus was destroyed or taken over, if you will, by the Assyrians in 732 BC. Northern Israel was taken by the Assyrians in 722 BC. Very, very close and relatable for the prophecy, and both things have been entirely fulfilled. But one of the things that's most remarkable is that the language of Isaiah 17:1, ceases to be a city, Damascus being made a ruinous heap, is such strong language to us, the modern reader, that it stops the context. Forget the fact that Isaiah 7, Isaiah 8, Isaiah 10, 2 Kings 16, Amos 1, on and on and on discuss this very same prophecy and how it's already fulfilled. No one cares about that. They only care about the fact that a ruinous heap and ceasing to be a city has not happened. And that's what we are. We focus on the what of the prophecy versus the who and the when and the why. And that's really what happened. As I really began engaging in trying to figure out what was the deal with this. Why is it that an event that was said to happen immediately to the initial receivers hasn't happened in 2,000 years? When I started to dig into it, it became very clear that we've created our own belief structure, our own prophecies. We've taken the prophecies and created something else. In Revelation, a city is destroyed. In Revelation 11, as you're moving into Revelation 12, the resurrection of the dead and the judgment takes place. In Revelation 18, a city is destroyed. As you move into chapter 19, resurrection of the dead, the judgment of the dead takes place. Revelation 20, a city is destroyed. As you move into chapter 21, the resurrection of the dead, the judgment takes place. And yet and still, this is a global catastrophe somehow that has never happened and is not the event which is the destruction of the city, which easily fulfills the rest of the prophecies from Matthew all the way through Jude. Revelation must be discussing something else. That's what I mean. It's ludicrous according to the narrative, and that's the unfortunate reality that I'm struggling with. I suspect other people will have to come to deal with, even if it's 10 years from now. So that's how it happened.